What I want to try to help us do today is understand why it is the way it is, why it looks like it looks, why it's so hard to break through, and what it is we need to be doing in order to understand and then begin to help this population. So without further ado, I'll just kind of get moving on. By the end of our talk today, there's 3 things I want you to know. I want you to be able to talk about what these jobs, like she just said, what these jobs do to people, do to families. Because every first responder comes home, and when they come home, what does that look like? What's it like when you've seen everything you've seen, you've responded the way you've responded, and you're supposed to be friendly and warm and nice and involved, and that's really tough. Now, I know that a lot of us work in the field of mental health and substance abuse treatment, and I think we have the exact same issue a lot of times. You come home, you've had that day, the day from not heaven, and you don't want to talk, and you don't want to be there, and yet there's 17 things you've got to do. And how are you supposed to be present when you just did all that? So that's something that's a trick that we have to learn how to deal with. The next thing I want to make sure we understand is, why is it that they're resisting, and what are the resistance points, and what can we do to overcome those? And then, if we're going to address mental health with first responders, what's the best way to go about it? What do we know that works? Is there any research behind it? Is it good stuff? Is it just anecdotal? And kind of where are we on the continuum of absolutely nothing to we're embracing them and wrapping them and they're accepting help? Because that's kind of what it looks like. Some important facts just to think about. It's no fun today being a police officer. I don't know if anybody knows that or not, but it's not any fun. Okay? Because how are you supposed to be an officer of the peace and a crime fighter all at the same time? Okay? Confidence is low in police. A lot of it has to do with specific events that happen, and then the way they tend to get publicized quickly. And we do live in, I was telling some folks over here, my wife's just become an Instagram, what's the word? She's Instagram famous all of a sudden. She said something on the news and now there's 300,000 posts about her. It's like, why did you do that? That's a whole other subject. I like what she had to say. But because of all that, when an officer walks out on the street every single day, everything is under a microscope. It's no fun, right, to live like that. If you look at it from the different perspectives, 80% of cops say that nobody understands what it is they're doing and how hard it is and what it really looks like. You know? And we keep coming across events where they come up on a homeless person, there's an altercation, sometimes they die, sometimes they get hurt, and yet that homeless person was paranoid schizophrenic and might have been attacking, or might not have been attacking. We don't know. But all we get is the news bite that says, police killed another civilian. And so that's what it looks like when they walk out every single day. Most cops believe that these shootings and things that happen are isolated events based on a single officer who may have done everything he or she could, or it may have been somebody who wasn't doing it right. But they certainly don't see it as systemic. The problem is that a majority of Americans believe that it's part of the bigger problem. The bigger problem being, what does law enforcement look like in America today? And what should it look like today? And why are we misunderstanding each other so poorly in a way that gets everybody on edge all the time? One of the most important things that's happened in policing in the last 25 years has to do with body cameras, right? Body cameras are game changers, okay? Because everything that happens is now recorded. Okay? And it's a double-edged sword. It goes both ways. So what we've noticed is that misconduct that's been captured has doubled. Okay? But they've also been able to get themselves out of a tight space or a jam or something that they got accused of because it wasn't really true. Okay? So I believe that video and body cameras are here to stay, and I think we probably need to have them. Okay? They're for everybody's benefit. If you look at the numbers, police departments are actually slow to adopt, okay? Because they like the way they do things. And they're not willing to change because we don't, we're LA, we do what LA does, we don't need to do what New York does, and vice versa. But if 95% are saying they're about to take on body cameras, it's one of the biggest things that's ever happened. And I hope that we keep using it the right way so that it has a much more objective view on what goes down. It seems to be more and more the things that don't go well are the things that aren't captured on film. If it's captured on film, it's pretty objective. When I talk about first responders, for today, I'm more or less talking about two specific groups. I'm talking about firefighters and I'm talking about law enforcement. We can certainly add in emergency room personnel, paramedics, EMTs. A lot of times they are placed with the firefighters, which is good. But also ER nurses and anybody who's in that role where you're getting the event right in your face right as it happens. If you think about the things that lead to problems for people in the fire department specifically, we've come up with what we call the annoying 9. Okay? And you may have the annoying 9 in your job too, and maybe you can relate and understand a little bit better. The first problem is that firefighter work is shift work. Okay? Shift work generally means it changes around quite a bit. And you don't always get first shift. You don't always get the shift you want. The shifts sometimes are 24 hours. The shifts sometimes are longer than that. And so when you have this kind of shift work going and your plans get changed on you because you also may be on call, and here you were about to go away for the weekend and now you're back in, that's a problem. And for those firefighters and other folks in shift work, when you have families and things around childcare have to change, that becomes a big deal. When you're both doing shift work, I mean, how many firefighters do we know who are married to nurses, right? How many police officers are married to other police officers? And the next thing you know, you've got this house filled with people in shift work. And you got 1, 2, 3, 4 kids, and it just creates chaos and it creates stress. Because the more you're having to deal with things like that, the harder it is on everybody. Okay? Plus you had a bad day. Okay? Sleep deprivation is a part of the job. Fortunately, that's been getting studied in different fields for the last 15 or 20 years more than ever before. They're beginning to change some rules around, for example, medicine residents, for how long they can be on duty, because we start to see mistakes at about 10 hours. The same can probably be said for firefighters. More and more studies are coming out. And again, firefighter life is tough. You're at the station house. Sometimes you get a really boring shift and you never leave the house except to go get McDonald's or whatever it is you do. But other times you got the entire shift and you never really come home again. So you never know what you're going to get. And if it's on and you're on duty, there's no stopping and there's no sleeping. And if you're in the middle of an event or an incident, no matter who you are, you're staying. You're not stepping out and letting someone else take over because it doesn't really work that way. That's for law enforcement too. Inadequate training has to do with the idea that sometimes we don't really know how to do our job the best way. Interestingly enough, I know that LAPD is working really hard to increase mental health understanding among officers so that when they come out to a situation, they know to assess and say, hey, what's going on here? Is there a big mental health component? And if there is a mental health component, what should we do about that? Maybe we should call in some mental health experts. And so those kinds of things are beginning to happen. But until you're trained and know what you're doing, it's another stressful situation. And oftentimes when it's a mental health issue, it's also extremely unpleasant because you're getting screamed at, because someone's really out of control, because they're bipolar manic, because they're high on all the stuff people get high on. And so that creates problems, especially without training. In the fire department, there's a lot of technical problems that you don't even think about. You know, when the pumper truck doesn't work, you're supposed to be putting out a fire. You know, when your axe handle breaks off, when you can't get access to something because the stupid key that's supposed to unlock the gate that goes to every gate in America doesn't work. There's things that happen that just increase stress incrementally over time. You don't really think about this, and we probably think about it in our own workplace sometimes, but sometimes you're with a bad crew. Sometimes you're in a station house where there's no friends, or there's a bully, or there's someone who is hyper-political about anything and everything, and you're stuck with them for 24 to 36 hours. And what's that like day after day, week after week, month after month? And then you're supposed to all be comrades and go out there and fight the fire or do the rescue or whatever it is you're supposed to do. And you hate that guy. And you don't want to be anywhere near that guy, and yet he's supposed to have your back. Okay? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on that people don't really talk about much. For other reasons, which is the culture of silence, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The malicious coworker kind of goes with the bad crew, can. Inconsistent policies. When you're a firefighter and you're driving the truck and you wreck the truck and your supervisor gives you a talking to, and then this guy wrecks the truck and he gets put on suspension for 3 days. What's that all about? Why did that happen to him and it didn't happen to him? We all run into those kinds of things in the workplace, right? Where things look inconsistent. Why wasn't I treated the same as somebody else? But you add that to all the other things, and you've got someone who's becoming a time bomb, who's going to have something happen sooner or later. Poor leadership is a problem. If you can't trust your leaders on a fire crew, who can you trust? Because if he's telling you to go into that burning building, or he's telling you to get over near that car that's about to fall off the edge of a cliff, or if he's telling you to go in there where it's kind of dangerous right this minute, and the police aren't here yet, what happens if it goes badly, or what happens if that was a mistake? Then you don't trust your leadership, and then we've got a broken crew. Broken crews happen more than anybody know. You know, we all think about going to the firehouse and taking our kids and letting them get a sticker and sit in the fire truck, and then firefighters are cool, right? And everybody loves firefighters because they're heroes. What we don't hear about is all that stuff that goes on the inside. Okay? And sometimes it's not pretty, not at all. And then ultimately, it's those bad calls. Okay? That's firefighter speak for something really bad happened. You know, that's where you go in and the little baby was abused by the family and it's not alive anymore. You know, that's where you go in and people are dead in a fire. All those things that we think of as the big T trauma. Okay? But that's number 9. That's after all the other things that are going on a frequent and regular basis. So firefighters are set up, okay, to have stress reactions to just about everything. Okay? So how do they manage is a big question. I like this cartoon. It's basically the way it's supposed to look on the outside versus how it feels on the inside. Right? You could say the same for yourself. Right? This isn't unusual. I mean, stress is stress. We all feel stress. It just seems like when it's a first responder and you're the one who's expected to handle everything and remain calm at all costs, what do you do when you're freaking out? Right? You know, a lot of people who work in emergency medicine or any kind of emergency services have this ability to be extremely calm under pressure. Ever notice that? I don't know why I do it, but I do it pretty well. When the you-know-what hits the fan, I'm the calmest guy around. And I can be calm for hours and hours and hours, and I can direct, and I can make people do everything they do, and then when it's all over and I get off by myself, my hands shake. Like that. And I don't know why. I do know why. But that's my response. Okay? So everybody has a different response, and what we're showing the public versus what we're feeling inside is often very different. When it comes to law enforcement, we have what's known as the terrible 10. Okay? These are the things that seem to happen again and again and are extremely disruptive to an officer's life in ways that he'll never or she'll never show you. Any line of duty death is bad. It's never okay. Never okay. One of my good friends is the head of OIS, Officer Involved Shootings for LAPD. And he spends half his time dealing with what just happened, and he spends the other half of his time in court defending lawsuits. It's one of the worst jobs I can ever imagine in my life. And he's the calmest, nicest guy you ever met. I think he has to be. Any kind of suicide, okay? Suicides have been a big deal in the last 2 months, right? Not because cops are killing themselves, not because firefighters are killing themselves, but because celebrities are killing themselves, which I find ironic. When a fellow police officer or a fellow firefighter kills him or herself, why is that so challenging? Because they're just like me. Because if that guy couldn't handle it, if that lady couldn't handle it, and I've watched them do things over and over again, I've watched them step up, I've watched them be brave, I've watched them de-escalate things that no one else could de-escalate, and now he's not on the planet anymore, what does that mean? So it's similar in some ways to that whole celebrity thing, where when you look at those celebrities who've killed themselves, and you think, wow, that person had everything, and if they had everything and they still killed themselves, what does that mean for me? But I think within first responders, it's a different level. It's a real response to real people who've done very heroic things for a long time, and now they can't do it anymore. That makes it tough. Any kind of awful injuries that happen get you? Anytime you're in a disaster or multi-casualty, there's something about that when you just see it here, that kind of gets emblazoned or imprinted in your brain. It's hard to get rid of it. Anyone who's shot anybody, it's a really big deal, whether you wounded them or killed them. And it doesn't matter how much self-defense it was. It doesn't matter if it was the perfect right thing to do, given all the circumstances. It still happened. For whatever reason, you guys know why, anything that has to do with kids is super traumatic. It's really difficult to see and to be a part of and to not want to do something about it immediately. And then anything that seems to take forever. You know, if you're out there forever, especially if it's an intense event, that takes its toll. So you can see how the stress starts to build up. And then you get this kind of stuff going nowadays, where I think the policing community is getting this feeling that, wow, we're the bad guys. Everybody thinks we're the bad guys. And most of us are really good guys and girls who do really good things on a regular basis. And yet things have gotten blown out of proportion, and unfortunately the world is a pretty black and white place. Right? You're either for me or you're against me. And we don't see things in gray the way we should. And we don't really reason things out to try and understand all the variables that go into something. Has anybody ever had a really bad thing happen at work, where, especially related to a patient, they AMA'd, they overdosed, they died, they assaulted another person, and then you think all the things you think about why it happened, and then have you ever been to a debriefing about it, or a root cause analysis meeting about it, and all of a sudden you start to look at it in a very deconstructing way, where you take apart all the little pieces and realize that that one person didn't do that. There were 17 things that happened. And all 17 things that happened got us here. And this is what happened. So let's work on these 17 things so that it doesn't happen again. And yet, we live in a time where news bites matter. And that's really all anybody sees, is the news bite. You know, I'm as guilty as anybody else. I always flip the thing on my iPhone to the right and see the top news. And all I really read is the headline, because I'm so busy. And who knows what I really think about what I just read. But I'm probably coming to a conclusion that I probably shouldn't come to, just because I read that 8-word headline. Not good. Just like everybody else, for cops, I don't need to go through this a whole lot because I kind of covered it in firefighters, but just in case I had a firefighter contingent here and a law enforcement contingent, I have to make sure I cover both, because otherwise they get upset with me about that. It's happened before. All the things about the way you work, all the dangers, everything bad that happens, all these kinds of things really play a role. Now what's a little bit different for law enforcement officers is what starts to happen after the arrest. Okay? So there's a whole other level that happens that you don't really see very much of. But a lot of times officers have to go to court. Okay? Like you might think, oh, they go to court for a traffic ticket. Right? And we're talking about other stuff. And when they know dead to rights, they've got this person. They know, they saw what happened. And then the person gets off. Okay? That starts to build up, and that starts to add up. So you start to feel like, what's the point? Why do I keep doing this if whatever I do doesn't really get anywhere because of the stupid legal system? They usually say the stupid lawyers, but the stupid legal system. Okay? Or, how is it that people who should be in jail are out? Because I just put that guy in there last week. And now he just did an armed robbery this week. How did that happen? He shouldn't even be out. And then everything to do with the media. They don't like to watch the news anymore, except they kind of have to watch the news because they have to know what everybody just heard or saw or felt. Because I have to deal with it. It's going to come my way. So I have to be prepared. Back to the work issue for just a minute. If you notice, on average, you see the 40-hour line. EMTs and firefighters are the ones who work more than any other crowd, any other group. Police are generally pretty good. LA is real good about trying to hold people to their hours because they're starting to get the message that if I have patrol officers or other officers out there and we're going over the time, then not only is it bad for them because their concentration and all those other kinds of things start to flag and their ability to make judgments flags, but it opens us up to liability. So it's as much that as it is anything else. It'd be nice if everything was done because it helped. But a lot of times it's done because it keeps us from getting sued. But that's the way it is. If you think about it, anything that has to do with helping other people directly has a really high rate of occupational injury. Okay? How many nurses do you know who have bad backs? I know lots. They've had surgery. Because what were they doing? They were just trying to help lift a patient off a bed. Or someone got up and they wrenched their back, and the next thing you know, they got bulging discs, and it's a bad story. And then sometimes they end up on opiates, and sometimes they end up in our treatment centers. Okay? Police officers, it happens all the time. There are so many police officers out for accidents and injuries and all those kinds of things, and firefighters too. I don't think I need to say a whole lot more about that. Interestingly enough, a lot of people, when they think about law enforcement and they think about first responders and they think about firefighters, they don't necessarily think about telecommunications and dispatch. Okay? But guess who's the first one? Guess who's getting screamed at? Guess who's hearing the horror? Because someone's calling saying something just happened. Or come save me, or I saw somebody shoot somebody. Okay? Over and over, study after study shows that dispatchers in that kind of one-off way directly experience PTSD over and over again. I don't know if anybody saw this study, but and some of you guys are way too young to remember this, but anybody remember the first Gulf War? Way back in like 1992? That was forever ago, right? Well, this really interesting thing happened. CNN was a baby news network back then, and somehow they had gotten themselves into a hotel in Baghdad. And there was a guy named Bernard Shaw, sorry. King's another guy. And he went on air, and he stayed on air for 12 hours. We watched Baghdad get bombed from the inside out. It was incredible. They started doing studies 3 months after that, 6 months after that, 9 months and a year, and then 2 years. And it was like 13 or 14% of the people who watched that were diagnosable with PTSD. Yeah, they were having all the symptoms of PTSD, and all they did was watch it on television. Okay? When I saw that come out, I decided from that moment on I'm reading the newspaper. And I kind of have ever since. I don't like watching the news. I don't like that in my face when I'm not ready for it to be in my face. I like to have a little control in what's coming my way. And so I think that's similar to what's happening with dispatchers. They're hearing everything and they're being told all this stuff live. And what are they supposed to do with that information? Just to refresh you guys a little bit, PTSD, they've experienced, witnessed, been confronted with an event or events that involve actual threatened death or serious injury, a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others, or it's their response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. What does a cop do? What's he supposed to do every day? All that. What's a firefighter supposed to do? All that. So in some ways, by definition of job description, it is PTSD. Period. But therein lies the conundrum, or the problem, is that don't you ever tell a police officer or a firefighter that he or she has PTSD. Anybody ever told one they have it? They ignore you. They tell you you're wrong and they won't ever talk to you again. Because they don't have PTSD. They've just seen some things. That's all that really is. Okay? So we've got to figure out better ways to use our language and to work with them, because there's reasons why they won't acknowledge PTSD. Okay? First and foremost, it may not be PTSD. Let's think about that for a minute. Okay? What does the P stand for in PTSD? Post. Okay? Traumatic stress disorder. Okay? What we're talking about really is being exposed to traumatic stress. Does that mean that later on we're going to have a disorder from it? Not necessarily. Not if we learn some skills to process. Not if we learn how to manage traumatic events, work them through, and leave them where they were. And we can keep moving. Okay. So we really ought to change PTSD, if we can, to TSD. And call it traumatic stress debriefing. Because that would make more sense. Because I've seen a lot of things in my life, and I don't have anything I flashback on. I really don't. Because I got trained a long time ago that the only way through something is through it. I don't know what just happened. I do know what just happened. See this? And he's filming that. I might need the audio-visual people for a second. Is everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Yes, sir. Very informative, sir.
It's very good.
If I only had the password, I could keep going. Let me just a minute. Did you know, those of you following along in your PowerPoint, did you notice that it's different?
Yes. Where are all the cool pictures, sir?
I thought I had to keep something for myself. Otherwise, you'd just be bored. See, that makes you pay attention. Okay? So whoever Angel Garcia is, he's coming to unlock it. Angel? Anybody ever worked in emergency management at all? In part of disaster planning, disaster management? It's an interesting world. I used to do it, like I said, at Hogue, and I did it at El Camino. And you think about all the gory stuff that's going to come into the hospital when something happens, especially when there's a big event. But one of the most interesting things that happens to the mental health folks is you get overrun by what's called the worried well. Have you ever heard of the worried well? Whenever anything bad happens, like about 3 times more people than actually are affected show up at hospitals. Because something could be wrong. Because there could have been something toxic. Because I saw it. Because of this, because of that. And so whenever you're at a hospital, you don't really, The ER prepares for the injuries, but everybody else prepares for everybody else who shows up. You guys may have remembered, it was in the early 90s in Tokyo, there was the sarin gas attacks. And there was like 1,000 people who got injured on the train. They had 100,000 people show up at hospitals saying they thought they might have gotten some nerve gas. And you have to deal with all those people. So a lot of times mental health isn't always just about those disorders, it's about how do you normalize things for people. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about with first responders, is how do we figure out how to normalize some of this in a way that doesn't just have them hold on to it and hurt themselves because it starts to wear on your brain, but that it's okay to work through stuff. Because if you don't work through it, it's going to become baggage. It's going to harm you. Or, another way to get to a first responder is to say, you don't want to do this to your kids. You don't want to do this to your spouse. Because if you don't take care of this, they get hurt. It's kind of interesting as we really built out our first responder program. I didn't realize it at the time, but 2 of my clinical directors at 2 of our different facilities, one of them is from a law enforcement family, like 3 or 4 generations, and he's the therapist. And the other one is, she's the clinical director, and all of her family are firefighters from New York City. And she became the therapist. It seems like every first responder family ought to have a therapist in there somewhere. Except they both say that they're always shouted down. It doesn't really work very well at a picnic. We close?
Close.
The power went out. It wasn't plugged in. Technical difficulties.
Let's do a memorization exercise.
Can I do a minute? Okay.
Yeah, we could ask some questions if anybody has any questions.
Anybody have any questions?
so far.
Hi.
Hi. So I was curious, what are some reasons why first responders won't acknowledge or accept that they have PTSD? I'm just curious, is it like an ego thing or embarrassed or?
Can you hold that thought? Because it's like the very next slide. It's like you're reading my mind, and you know exactly where I'm going with this. Those are some of the reasons for sure.
Oh, I see.
That's part of it. There's a little more to it too.
Do you need one of these? We could follow along right here.
I could try.
Okay. We'd like.
What's your slide?
Way on down there. Right as you said that, he's ready.
Oh, good.
It's fine.
That's fine. I'll just move it myself.
I apologize about that.
That's okay.
It's not okay, but we'll make it okay.
I'm exhibiting how we do stress management when you're up talking in front of a bunch of people. Right, so some facts about the prevalence of mental health issues. 85% have symptoms. Okay, now symptoms doesn't mean a diagnosis, right? But it means they certainly have several of the criteria for various things, whether it's PTSD, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 50% will not seek help. Why? Because of this culture and the stigma that goes with the job they have, which we'll talk about in a minute. And yet, first responders have double the rate of alcoholism as the general population. Does everybody know, by the way, that adult alcoholism went up by 50% between 2009 and 2018? What have we been paying attention to for the last 10 years? Oh, 7 years. Opioids. Look what snuck in again. Alcohol never leaves. It just gets craftier. Craft beer. At least I thought it was. You thought it was funny. So, why don't they ask for help? Because, first and foremost, it's a sign of weakness. Because my supervisor will not treat me the same if I ever say a word. I won't get the shifts I want. I won't get the duties I want. They might put me behind a desk. They might not let me be out there the way I need to be out there. If they talk about it in front of anybody else, then they look like the weak link. And I can't be the weak link, so I can't tell anybody about it. Most people in law enforcement, most people in firefighting, they want to build their time. Right? They want to head towards retirement at some point. And if they can get some promotions along the way, that really helps the family bank account. And yet if they bring up anything that has to do with a problem, then the fear is they will not be considered. So I will kill my career if I ever say there's anything wrong with me. Has anybody ever felt that way in your job? It's not completely unusual. You feel like if you speak up, if you step up and say something, then somehow that paints a target of one kind or another that says, you're a whistleblower, you're a complainer, you can't take it, you're not tough enough, you're always complaining about the overtime. It goes on and on. And yet, that's not how it's supposed to work. But within this culture that's a tough guy, tough girl culture, where nothing hurts, never let them see you bleed, none of that kind of stuff. How could I ever say, boy, that last one got me? You know, I left and I puked because I just couldn't stand the sight of that. So no one ever says it, but all 10 guys on the truck went off and puked. They just all went to their own little place, and no one ever looked at anybody else's puke. Kind of how it works. What happens to first responder families? First of all, first responders tend to have long hours. They tend to be gone a lot. It's kind of funny, all through life with certain careers, it's something that families have to accommodate and tolerate, if not accept. So, you know, one of the traumas of my childhood, which sounds really silly compared to this stuff, is that I lived in a small town. My dad was a family practice doctor, and everybody loved my dad. He was Dr. Tom. And we lived in the kind of town where sometimes we got paid with half a beef. We didn't get paid food. I mean, we didn't get paid money, we got paid food. And my dad delivered babies, and he did appendectomies, and everywhere he went, it's like, oh, you're Dr. Tom's kid? He's so great. Dr. Tom never came to one of my baseball games, football games, basketball games, soccer games, anything. Never came to anything because he was always at the hospital. Always. And I remember the one time he came to a football game, I was a little guy and they made me play defensive end. I made 4 sacks and intercepted for 2 touchdowns in the one game my dad watched. Okay? First responder families feel the same way. It's like they're never there. They don't show up. They can't. But you can't be mad at them. Because what are they doing? They're saving lives. They're keeping the streets safe. They're doing everything that we need them to do. And so what's a first responder family go through? Feeling that loneliness sometimes? Or feel like you care about your job more than you care about us? Which is not true. But there gets to be this perception that if you're not there for me, where are you? And then one of the other rules is we don't talk about what happened at work when we get home. Okay? But do you think it doesn't show? And who do you think you are? You're not that good. And so over time, all those traumas that you're experiencing as a first responder show up in your kids. They show up in your spouse. They show up all over the place. And your kids are acting out. Or your kids are isolated. You feel disconnected from your spouse, or you're arguing all the time. Next thing you know, you're headed for divorce. We don't even want to look at divorce rates among police officers. 75%. It's pretty bad. Because that culture is at home. Don't talk about anything. What's ironic is I've had the best success working with police officers and firefighters when I've treated their children. Never them directly. Treated them for addiction, treated them for mental health issues, get the family involved as part of a family program. I've had more police officers and firefighters cry in my arms about their kids, but they're really crying for themselves. It's a way it's okay. I love it. Of course, you know, I'm one of those guys where my mission in life is to make you cry, and then I feel good, right? Because that's healing. My kids hate it. So, other reasons, the barriers, like you were bringing up. Suck it up, man. What are you talking about? No? Life's tough. You picked this job. You knew what you were signing up for. You already served in a war. This is easy. You know what an honor it is to serve in the fire department? How could you ever complain? The first responder F word. Don't ever say feelings. Don't say feelings. I think what's interesting is as our generations change, you know, as we've gone from the baby boomers to Generation X to Generation Y or the millennials, and now we're about to hit Z, there seems to be changes in the way we approach mental health, self-awareness, self-care. It's going to be really interesting to see how millennials and then how the Generation Z kids growing up are going to treat things like this, because they're still going to be first responders. They're going to be cops and they're going to be firefighters, and I'm hopeful that we're changing things in a way that it's more and more okay to talk about how you feel about stuff. You just have to figure out the right place and the right way to do it. I think the other major barrier is all of us. Because like I said at the very beginning, we're not in the community of first responders. We haven't been there, we haven't done that, we don't truly understand. I think sometimes folks who want to be a part of it are perceived as kind of having a prurient interest. You want to hear about the gore, you want to see the nasty stuff, you want to just kind of be around it because that's cool. And that's not what it is at all for them, for first responders. And so it's always going to be a very small group of people that first responders can trust. Which is interesting because what I've noticed in the field of addiction and behavioral health treatment is that there's been a bit of an explosion in first responder programs, right? A lot of programs are saying, we've got a first responder track. We can do this now. And I think we need to be careful with that because I think there are going to be places where that's best treated by people who really specialize there. It's a very specialized world. The same thing is happening with professionals. You know, so there's very few programs around the country that focus on physician treatment. Working with physicians is an amazing experience. It will make you absolutely crazy, and it's extremely rewarding at the same time. And it makes you want to shoot them, and it makes you wonder how they ever got the degree they got sometimes. Because when the anesthesiologist shoots himself with fentanyl during the operation and falls down and then the patient dies, that's a bad thing. And we all understand that as addicts and alcoholics, but when you have someone else's life in your hands, somehow that changes. Feels like it changes. And I think sometimes the same thing is true with first responders. It's like, well, you've got the public trust. You've got everyone's life in your hands. And how can you mess up at work? And so there, how can we even talk about it? Because there's so much shame attached to having a problem. What's really interesting to me is that the National Fire Prevention Association in 2014 came out with a really big push on mental health for firefighters. Okay? Really big push. And what was fascinating to me about that is they skipped right over substance abuse. And I've talked to some of the folks here in LA County and Orange County, and the general idea was that substance abuse is such a stigma. and it's such a game changer and a deal breaker, and it takes you out, that directly confronting that is something you can only do case by case when situations happen. But we can all begin to talk about mental health. And really what we should be talking about is mental wellness. Because what we really should be doing is, how do we help people become resilient? Because that's really what we're talking about. How do we help people prevent ever going down the rabbit hole of PTSD? Because if I can keep talking about stuff now, then I can leave it, like I said before, and I don't have to worry about it again as much. This is another fun one. I don't know if you can see it up there. Peer support is one of the primary ways to work with police officers and firefighters, because their peers can help them if they're willing to self-identify as someone who has some stuff to talk about. It's getting bigger, it's gaining traction. Orange County Sheriff's Department has a really good one. Forcing critical incident stress debriefings has begun to help. There's a couple of international and national organizations that really do a good job of helping people, first responders, get through things. And what you can see from the cartoon, if you could see it, is it says rescue and peer support, but I'm not drowning yet because my nose is above the water. Even though 95% of me isn't, I'm waiting until I just can't breathe. And yet all the things that are happening are going to get you. So what do we need to do? More and more first responder organizations, whether it's the department, whether it's the union, whether it's the association, needs to really start talking about mental health among our officers and among our firefighters. Not that we have to diagnose anybody, but that we have to talk about this stuff exists. How do you manage it now so it doesn't become something later? Over and over again. If we don't change the culture of first responders, it's only going to get worse. It's never going to get better. We all know that, right? What happens to mental health issues untreated? They become bigger mental health issues, right? The departments also need to start to work on how do we level things out and how do we normalize stuff so that when bad things happen, we all talk it through. And we're not focused on casting blame. We're only focused on improving the performance. So the next time something happens, we all do things a little differently. I was talking with somebody recently who was taking a voluntary patient from a residential mental health facility to be evaluated at an ER. Wasn't really acutely saying anything dangerous to self or others or disabled, but nonetheless, probably the best move was to get this person there and have them evaluated. They stopped at a stoplight. Guess what happened? The guy jumped out and ran away. Okay? So what's your first critical incident debrief question there? Huh?
How did it happen?
How did it happen? My first question was, how many people were in the car? Turns out it was just the driver and the guy in the back seat. It's like, what? You should always have two people. At least. Or, why didn't we think about calling an ambulance and having them take them in? Right? So things happen in the heat of the moment, and the question is, what do you do about it? Do you debrief it? Do you figure out the better answer? Do you correct to move forward? Because we're not perfect. We won't do things perfectly. And in law enforcement and firefighting, we have to think about that too. Because every single thing that happens needs to get looked at again. So that we can change what we do. Or not change what we do. We may have said, wow, we were on. We handled it the best way we could. Even though bad things happen. Doesn't mean we didn't do the best job. We need that for employee assistance programs, all the various associations that provide support, to get more and more proactive, to bring help in. Even if it's simply education. Okay? Because you're not going to change a culture by telling people to do something different. You're gonna have to start showing them things, right? It's like when we think about drug and alcohol stuff, when should you be talking to kids about drug and alcohol stuff? When is it too late?
They're doing it.
Is it ever? Okay. So, I think you talk to kids at every age in an age-appropriate way. And I think, technically speaking, if you wait till they're 14 or 15, you've probably waited too long. Because they're not listening to you anymore. Okay? And then we're on to the next generation. So let's start to work on things now so that the next generation of first responders knows how to manage themselves better and their stress so that it doesn't have to become post-traumatic distress disorder, so they don't have to get divorced 4 times, so that they don't have to think about killing themselves, so that they don't think about driving off a bridge, or getting in fights, or whatever those symptoms are that they might have. Technically speaking, everything on this page is a whole other lecture or a class or a year's worth of training, right? Because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we teach resilience. This is where we try to push peer support programs, the critical incident stress debriefings, how we talk about mental toughness and mental wellness. Because if you framed it like that and you took that to firefighters and police officers, do you think they'd listen? All right, gentlemen, today we're going to talk about mental toughness. We're going to talk about mental wellness. I'm not going to have a talk that says, all right, today we're going to talk about why you guys puke after everything happens and why you cry a lot. You can't explain it because they're not going to listen to me. Right? So let's figure out a language that's going to work. Let's figure out a way to talk to these guys and girls so that they have a way that feels like, hey, they know what's going on with me. I don't have to acknowledge that this is a weakness, because maybe it's not. I'm just learning how to be better at it so that it never becomes that. And then I think you also work with them a lot about how this is going to affect your family if you don't. Some important things to remember, just in the basic way, and then I'll wrap it up for this one. Anybody ever work with a first responder? Did you ask them how they felt? Don't start there. Ask them what happened. Ask them what's going on. Because the more you let it be fact-based for them, the less charged it is for them, and the more they're willing to get to their feelings. When I say, how'd you feel about that? It's part of the job. It sucked. Oh, you know, shit happens. That kind of stuff. Until you've established rapport. And then the next thing you know, you can talk about things. You have to normalize a lot. Like I just told the story about all the guys on the fire truck who all go off and throw up by themselves. I just normalize that. Everybody does it. It's just what happens. Okay? Well, if you think, wow, everybody does that, then you think, well, maybe I'm not so weird. Maybe it's something we can actually talk about. Always talk about what's going on at work gets them at home. It's one of the best ways to get them to talk. Because they tend to want home to be good. They tend to love their families. And so if they can start to see that there's a connection between me keeping my mouth shut and holding all that stuff inside and me coming home and then exploding, then they may be able to work on some stuff. Because that's better. Okay? You can see up here what not to do. A lot of times just being with them is a good thing, not necessarily forcing conversations. But again, it has to do with what the context is. Why are they there? What are they doing? Or were they forced in to see you? You know, if they've been sent for an evaluation or somebody says, hey, you need to go see somebody, you're not going to get much. It typically has to be something where they are more proactive and or there's other people doing it who they trust. Whoever was the first one in the door, to the fire, you need to have that guy also the first guy in the peer support group. And then everybody will start talking. So, what we know is when you talk with first responders about how to manage their jobs and their stress, they listen. Okay? But when you talk about anything else, they tend to close their ears pretty quickly. So again, come up with the words that we want to use so that they're hearing us and not turning us off. And the next thing you know, we've made an impact, and then they start giving each other techniques. I came across a fire, I won't say which one, but I came across a firehouse in Long Beach a couple of weeks ago. I was riding my bike, and I was out of water, and I just decided I would stop, and I went in, and the door was up, and there was 3 guys in on the floor sitting down, and they were all meditating. And they were firefighters. And I said, I won't tell. And they said, it's okay if you do. So something's starting to happen, right? Things are starting to change for the better. Right, so that's basically an overview of first responders and kind of why it is the way it is, what it is that it looks like. You can just see how it all leads to trouble with mental health. Again, I find it fascinating in the first responder world that we've kind of put substance use disorders into a bubble and not really talking about it a lot, and we've decided it's okay to talk about mental health. So if we have to do that backdoor approach, I'm fine with that. Because if we keep talking about their mental health issues, their substance use disorder is going to come up too, right? We know that. And it's basically whatever door they come through is where we'll meet them, and then we'll try to help them get where they need to go. So first responders are a lot of fun to work with, and they're very challenging to work with. And does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
I can certainly say that you brought a lot of humanity into what it means to be a first responder, because you kind of put them on the same level that we all are on. They all, by acknowledging the fact that they go through things, and I'm certainly appreciative of that. And I only wonder, I watched something on Netflix about the Flint, Michigan Police Department.
Right.
And those people were like really stressed out, and I kind of felt for them. I really did feel for them. They're understaffed. I wonder how many programs like yourself, or do you have any sort of plan to kind of like try to get this type of thing nationwide for public servants across the country? Because I certainly see that there's a huge need for this type of thing. Because now you start to understand, this is why situations blow up. These people are stressed to bleed out.
Yep.
And so are other people. So you have 2 people that are stressed out, and that meet, and it's like a powder keg, so to speak. So, is there anything being done to bring this sort of?
Yeah, I think department by department, they're all talking to each other. They all know about peer support. They know things like that. What has to happen is basically every single department, every jurisdiction, however it works, has to have champions. Has to have people in departments and in the union or in the association who's willing to say, I will carry the flag for this, I'll push it. And then folks like us can come in and support that. And we can be the expertise, we can teach them to do things. But I think the most effective is ultimately going to be stuff that's in or near the department. Because they have to own it, and if they own it, then it will get better. And if it continues to be outsiders, then they won't really trust it, and they'll think that somehow it's going to end up on my records. And so it's tough. It's tough. But I think we're going in the right direction. The bigger departments are doing it. LAPD's doing it. London Orange County's doing it. New York's doing it. So it's coming. Again, I hate to say it, but I think a lot of the old guys have to die. All the old soldiers, they can't do it another way. They just can't. And I don't really mean die, I just mean retire. And go off into the sunset, right, and sit on the beach, whatever it is they want to do. And the younger ones have to come in who know that it's a whole mind-body connection. If you don't take care of it, it's gonna make everybody suffer, including yourself.
Well, how do the young people even come in with that sort of mindset? Where does it start to, what do you think it starts to get people to understand that it's okay to kind of like seek help outside of yourself to deal with the things that you're inevitably going to go through?
I hope that it's stuff that's being taught in schools more, just in a more general way. I also think it's something that if the academies ever latch onto it, then they'll start to force it. And they have started to do some stuff. There's special kinds of training that's starting to happen earlier in the process, because if it's part of what you learn from the very beginning, then you tend to do it. And if it's something that you get told later on, oh, by the way, we got this guy coming in here, he's some kind of psychologist, he has some shit to say to you. All right, you got 5 minutes. Because that's how it's looked. No one's listening to that. So it's how important do we make it? So, and that's up to the departments. Thanks.
I have a statement and then I guess kind of a question. So part of the being in the drug and alcohol abuse field and working with first responders, even wider scope with VA or whatever the population may be, having the union or EAPs that only give you a certain amount of time to treat the client, like, 30 days, 90 days, like how are you supposed to, right? Like, and finding people like yourselves out there, like for us that there's thousands of treatment facilities throughout the United States with these type of clientels, like how do we connect those dots and treat better?
I think we can help get together a list. There are more and more consortiums and ways that connect first responders, veterans into mental health services. Again, a lot of it is peer-driven, but it tends to have facilitators with it. Long Beach VA has a really good little system going that has a lot of peer support, and they do good work. I think we just have to open our eyes to the fact that we all have treatment centers, and we like treating people, and they're our patients, and they're paying us, and whether it's mental health or substance abuse. But the fact of the matter is, they are special populations. And so what do you want to do for your special population? And it may mean that you have to, remember when we do our treatment plan, it's treat, refer, or defer. And so maybe that's something that we have to defer to the end of treatment, and we have to refer it to the right agency, but be sensitive to the fact that it's going on and we need to do something about it, and maybe learn how not to pry right now, but to have it be a part of the treatment plan. To say that, all right, when this is all over, we're getting you hooked up with a peer support group for first responders, for firefighters, and let's go ahead and make that connection while you're still with us, because you need to do your work there. You can't do it anywhere else. It's like, sometimes you get a physician in a treatment program who is not in a physician-only treatment program, and that guy or that girl really needs to start going to caduceus meetings, which are 12-step meetings for physicians and other probably doctoral level folks in the healthcare. And they need to get started, because they aren't always going to feel comfortable going to a regular AA meeting because of lots of issues, lots of reasons. And so let's all decide that we're going to be really good at what we're good at, and we're going to be the best in the world at referring to the other people who do the best at what they do. And so there's going to be a first responder population of treatment programs or professionals or peer support groups. Let them have them, because that's where they belong. Because otherwise we may be doing more harm than good. You guys want a break? All right, thank you very much.